and Kabbalah. And the notion of Kabbalah in general is that nothing is coincidence. The most seemingly far-fetched things, I shouldn't say far-fetched, far-spaced things, completely unrelated at first glance, must have some relationship. Why? Because the world is made by whom?
God.
And what's his prime trait?
Ubiquitous.
Oneness.
Omniscient.
Oneness. The one that we really
Everything is
stress.
one.
He's got lots of traits. They're in this week's Parsha. Chanun, Rachel, Chayim, Chesed. But the one that's most stressed, that we recite and proclaim twice every day, is Hashem Echad. He's one. So if he is one, it's a reasonable presumption that the world he made is one. And you'll suddenly find that a fish somewhere in the Red Sea, the Moshe Rabbeinu fish, may contain an enzyme or hormone which is a cure for hemophilia. No reason to expect such a thing if he is not one, if he is two or more. But if he is one, everything in the world should relate to every other thing, which is the book that really takes things seemingly so unrelated in God's blueprint world, in the Torah, and shows how one verse in Isaiah may be the real explanation of understanding a passage from Shemot. That's the Talmud. The Talmud takes things from all over, seemingly disparate, finds a slight connection. Well, the same word was used here and the same word there. Or some very seemingly trivial connection, and suddenly everything connects up. And you get a whole concept coming out of it, which you wouldn't know from the separate things. Now let's take our Parsha, KI-TISA. Picture a little child who's come from the United States to Israel. Let's say a child about 3, 4 years old, and he begins to speak a mixture of English, Hebrew and English. How might he translate KI-TISA? How might he translate it? He'll come up to his grandfather Saba.
I've got a translation.
How would you translate KI-TISA
Count.
if you were a little
Take a
immigrant?
canto.
Huh?
I've written, every time you take a canto.
Every-
Not when you. Every time.
All right, now you're translating ki.
Key.
All right,
No,
but
every
that's the
time.
usual translation.
No.
How would a little 3 or 4-year-old Israeli use the word sisa for counting?
It's to carry.
T-sport.
That's it. Also.
To carry. Is that used much in contemporary Hebrew? No, it's also animerim. So how might a little 3 or 4-year-old kid translate it? Ki sisa.
Raise.
Really? What do
Yeah.
you go up on and come down on?
A seesaw.
Seesaw.
Okay?
Swing.
A seesaw.
A seesaw.
You don't actually go up and down the swing, so you go back and forth.
That's how you distorted pronunciation of the word KI-TISA.
All right, fine, but let's say he's an Ashkenazi. So he says, KI-TISA. When you go on the seesaw. And it seems like a way far, it's cute, but it seems like a far-fetched idea. But indeed, when you stop to think about it, a seesaw may be the most apt metaphor or simile for what happens in our parsha and our season. What do you do with a seesaw?
Up and down.
Up and down.
Why do you enjoy
You
it?
swing between the
Why do you enjoy it? Why does one enjoy a seesaw? This is a little Purim Torah too, since tomorrow night is Purim, so we can have a little lighter touch. Why do people enjoy it?
Because once they feel on the high, and once they feel on
But it's a
Yeah,
form
no,
of
because every time
play.
you get down, you come up again.
It's a form of play.
Or, yeah, which do they enjoy more, the going up or the coming down?
Good.
No.
Equally.
it's, oh, when they go up, they don't have to work for it. Somebody else is pushing it.
Yes, well, which do you enjoy?
You
They
know,
probably enjoy them. You
going
say
up
equally.
is like a work, and coming down it's a release.
It's a game when they enjoy it.
Okay, so by making a wild association like that, he seesaw, could you see how the theme of this whole parsha might be expressed by a seesaw?
Yeah.
As
The
well.
Mazal of Israel keeps changing.
Where do you see it in
As
this
its ups
parsha?
and downs.
Where do you see it in this parsha? Which parsha most shows the up and downs? This one. Isn't that interesting? The Egel. We complete Moshe's instructions gotten from God on Sinai as to how to do all the work of the tabernacle, that place where man assimilates God and comes back to God. The tabernacle, which is a microcosmos of the model of the whole universe, the pattern of the whole Torah, through which the universe is created. But it's a seesaw. From the very heights, as high as you can go, they suddenly go down as low as you can go with the golden calf. This season, this week that we happen to be reading it this year, is there an aspect of seesaw in our holiday of this week? Sure. What's Purim? Up and down and up. And who knows after? The Jews are up at Purim. Regan invites them with special UO kosher meals to the White House, to Achashverosh's feast. The Jews are invited. They go to this feast, which features utensils from the Beit HaMikdash, again connected to our Parsha. He shows off all his pride and all the things he's captured. They're up. They're really part of their country. All of a sudden comes a Haman, or a Hitler, or whatever species of Amalek is around. And the Jews are in panic. Jesse Jackson has decided they don't want any more Jews in America. And the Jews are in panic. Down. All of a sudden comes Esther and Mordecai up. Do we really celebrate Purim? Oh no. One of the main things of celebration isn't there. What? A real high celebration, not just a momentary victory, but something of real eternal greatness. How the Jews celebrate it. What do we do to celebrate Passover and Sukkot and Shavuot? We say Hanukkah even.
We don't fast.
Don't fast. That we don't do in Purim either. We say Hanukkah. We sing songs of praise to God called Hanukkah. Well, in Purim, we do not say Hanukkah. There's various answers.
Well, I heard yesterday a rabbi saying that the Megillah itself might be considered...
Some say the Megillah is a huge praise of God. That's a
God's name
difficult
is not
view.
mentioned in
Yeah, that's why that view is difficult. If you're praising God, why keep quiet about it? His name isn't in the Megillah. So others say because it's a miracle that it only has temporary significance in that it didn't happen in Israel. The Jews are temporarily wherever they are. And if the Jew is saved today, who knows what happened 10 years later in Persia, or 30 years later, or 50 years later, or 100 years later. So there is no permanence. So it's a seesaw, literally. So both our Parsha of KI-TISA and the holiday around which it occurs this year, Purim, is in the nature of a seesaw. And I would say maybe the joy of going on a seesaw, besides the pure physical joy, is a certain sense in the human being that he's always in danger. What Reb Nachman of Bretzlav say? Kol ha'olam kulo, gesher tzar ma'ol. The whole world that we're in is a very narrow bridge. Va'ikar, but the essential message, lo nefachad klal, not to be at all afraid of falling off. The world is a very narrow bridge. You should be afraid. If you fall off, you're finished. Of course, what he says isn't so reasonable. If the world is a very narrow bridge, you should be afraid. Maybe it's not to be afraid at all. How can I not be afraid? So I would modify Reb Nachman's metaphor for the life, and I would say it's different in the Torah. All the world is a very narrow bridge, and you should be somewhat afraid. However, there's a big trampoline under the bridge. So even if you fall off, God usually lets you spring back. Mashpil Geim, we say in Tefillah. God lowers, puts down the proud, the high, the mighty. What comes right after that? Mashpil Geim Magbiya Shefalim. And he raises up the one who has fallen down. So if God makes fall down the one who has raised himself up, who is haughty and proud and feels he is the one who has achieved his own destiny, rather than using the talents and resources that God's given him. But he has a feeling of self-pride and self-confidence. The Dale Carnegie self-confident man is not the man of our Bible, where we say, Ashrei Adam Sheh B'fachei Tavi. Happy is he who's in a certain constant fear and dread.
Yeah, but fear of God. But you have to fear God and fear nothing else at all.
Well, I don't know.
We mustn't fear the others.
I'm exploring this. It's not so simple. Reb Soloveitchik said we trade all the little fears in for one big one, like consolidating your debt. But I would say very simply, if we say God is mashpil Gerim, brings the haughty, the proud down, so what happens to them after they're down?
Then they correct themselves.
And what happens then?
Then they go up again.
Oh, not be funny.
Yeah.
It's not two different
He
groups of
humbles
people,
the
in my
proud
opinion.
and he raises
It's
the
a
humble.
cycle through man's life. God puts him down to teach him a lesson. For his eternal salvation, he's got to shape up. But, hopefully, he will rise up out of that again. Where's an example, perhaps, of that? Perhaps the book of Job. Okay. So I say, since we all sense life, and I still say it's like a trampoline, most times God lets things spring back. Therefore, a person always needs to be reassured that when he does go down, he will come back up. So maybe part of the joy is to be able to experience a sudden fall and even let yourself a little bit feel the fear of it, like going down a roller coaster. And then be raised right up again. You're back up there. I don't know if anyone has written on the psychoanalytic aspects of the seesaw, but I'm suggesting that it's such a blatant symbol for basic life fears and activities that it naturally arouses in the person a certain joy, because at least for these moments, the person is able to feel that no matter how low he goes, nothing's going to happen to him. It'll feel a little scary if he goes down fast. He may get a little bump when the seesaw bangs the ground on the bottom if it's not too well constructed. But basically, he's going to spring right up there. He's going to spring right back up without even any effort on his part. So I think it's a very good way to remember Parashat KI-TISA. Okay, now let's actually start the Parsha after that diversion. It is chapter 30, which we started last week. I will read, no thank you, when you lift up or raise up the head of the children of Israel, or the son. This is a very difficult verse to understand. If you read it casually, it sounds okay. Look, I'll read the first few verses. When you lift up the head of the children of Israel, this basically refers to taking a census. Livkudehem, according to their records, their numbers. V'nosnu ish kofer nafsho. Then each person should give an atonement for his soul. Ladonoi, to God. Bivkolosam, when you count them. Why? What does he have to give an atonement for? What's he done wrong? You're just counting the guy. V'lo yevahem negef, that there should be no plague, bivkolosam, when you count them. Zeyitnu, this is what they should give. Kol over al pekudim, everyone who passes before the census taker. Machatzis shekel, half of a holy shekel, the shekel hakodesh. Esrim gera hashekel, it's 20 geras of silver. Machatzis shekel, again it's repeated, the words half a shekel. Trumal adonai, a raised up offering, a gift to God. All those who pass by the census from 20 years old and up should give the raised offering of God. The rich man is not to be giving more, and the poor man is not to give less. This is not a donation which depends on one's wealth. It's a fixed poll tax, let's call it.
It means all sides are equal. That's how I do.
Yes, mimachatzis hashokel. L'asesses trumas adonai, l'chaper alav shosechem. Again, to make atonement for your souls. And then you will take the silver of the atonement from the children of Israel and give it for work in the meeting tent, the tabernacle. And it shall be a reminder, a remembrance for the children of Israel before God to atone for their souls. That's the whole first section. Up to verse 17. Now, what do you make of that? Does it make any sense? What is the problem here? First of all, what's it doing here? We were in the middle of a description of the tabernacle. In Truma, we read all about its construction and the materials for it. In Tetzaveh, we read about the Kohanim, their clothes, their inauguration, perhaps how they use it. And we ended with the golden altar, which was specially reserved for the section of the Kohanim. Are we still missing anything from our description of the tabernacle after those two parshas? You say no. Anyone have a different guess? We had the menorah, we had the ark, we had the table, we have the brass altar. One second. Showbread, we had all that we had in Truma. And Tetzaveh, and we discussed it last week, separately was listed the golden altar. Is there anything else? We had the curtains and the structure. That's we had. There's one other thing which we haven't had yet.
We're coming to the
basin. The basin in which the Kohanim washed what?
hands and feet.
Hands and feet before doing any sacrifice or any holy service going into the tabernacle. That's not put in the beginning here. You think, let's finish it off already. Instead, we get this law of donating half shekels to be used for service in the temple as an atonement when you count. I mean, God is not absent-minded. God doesn't have to, oh, Moshe, I forgot. In case you ever count, let's get back down to the tabernacle and do the basin. No, God doesn't work like that. God has it better than any computer, all programmed out. So the question is why this comes in now at all. What's the next big question? Really big question.
The maintenance of the...
No, the next, question on this portion of the census through the half shekels.
Yeah, why? First of all, it's about warriors, isn't it?
I'm sorry?
It's warriors that have to give a half shekel.
Apparently, because it's
counting
qualified.
the soldiers.
All right. That's already in the answer. Why is it limited to men 20 years and above? If you're taking your census, take women, children.
Somebody under 21 have
Right, why? Why? Why aren't they counted? Because only from 20 years old is a boy to go into the service. My son's being drafted tomorrow. I personally don't like it. Not much I can do about it. I don't think it's right that they should take him at 18. The Torah specifies at 20. And there's a world of difference, not in fighting ability, but in maturity, and especially with the present problems of dealing with the rebellious population of Arabs. It's very hard for an 18-year-old to have the self-control to be able to combine patience and firmness.
Formation of their character.
Yes.
Well, they don't use 18-year-olds on the front.
Yes.
I'm not talking in the front, I'm talking in Shechem.
That is the front.
One of my friends who was 18 years old just came back from Shechem.
Yes, I'm just really
Actually, he may be 19
They
already.
take them there.
Yeah.
He may already be 19.
No, they must pass through
Perhaps
thorough
even
training.
Huh?
Surely they must pass through very thorough training.
Yeah, but still he's an 18-year-old.
And yet, are they not obliged to marry at 18?
Yes, an 18-year-old is not so mature yet. We say even that God does not punish them. That unlike human punishment, where God does things, usually he does not punish someone less than 20. We have 13 for a certain maturity where your acts can have meaning, where you can do a mitzvah and be counted for a minyan. But in terms of holding you really responsible, assuming that you have real self-control, our traditional age for that is 20 years old. So that would fit very nicely.
So where did the...
You know what happens with kids?
Where did the non-Jews get 18 from, legally?
I don't know. That's their problem. But they say old enough to fight because they made them fight at 18, so old enough to fight, old enough to vote. But of course, every 18-year-old goes through a tremendous transition until he's 20. You know who goes through the transition? His parents. He seems like stupid jerks when he's 18. When he reaches 20, 21, gee, my parents have really improved the last few years. There is a maturity.
So now we're going to watch you change. Now we're going to watch you change.
Yeah, you don't have to be so mature to get married. Especially if a person has had a more healthy Jewish sexual upbringing, where they don't fool around before marriage. And their bride or groom is their first partner. And there's a certain joy which they get from them, which is not comparable if they've had many. So that joy and the pleasure of new marriage before the kids come can get them through a year or two until they grow up a little more. Not to be so grown up to have babies even. You see all the little girls, 8, 9, 10, 12 years old. You mop the stuff from Showroom, we're taking care of babies all day. Yeah, but it's when kids get a little older into maturity, maybe more to deal with them. Anyway, so I'd say, so as Admon said, that what happens is that you only count from 20 here, because this is not a general census. This is a military census for the men who go to war. And therefore, who is not counted in this census? Levites, who don't go to war. We do have a concept of kollel, of holy people who don't go to war. But it's limited to one group, Levites. And it struck me that someone who really wants to be machmir, wants to be strict in observing the various views in Jewish tradition, should not support any kollels where people who are not Levites sit and learn rather than work. And that maybe only Levites should have a yeshiva exemption from the army.
What happens if a Levite refuses to go to the army?
Today?
Now, yes, today.
That's an interesting case.
Yes.
I don't know.
You can't say anybody's a
I don't buy that so much. They're always so worried that the one who says he's a Kohen or Levi isn't. I would assume on the whole Jews kept it pretty accurate, especially where they're religious as far back as we know, where they didn't lose contact with the tradition. Within the religious community, if someone says he's a Kohen, I assume he's a Kohen or Levi.
Because
But there is
in the yeshiva, when they postpone their service, okay, something, but here it's a Levite, he's not allowed to go, so he refuses. What happens really?
I know, I doubt if the Israeli government recognizes this rabbinic exemption, and perhaps when there's grave danger, maybe then the exemption doesn't apply. I don't know. All right.
There's another way to look at it, where it isn't to become a non-Kohanim. So
Yes,
it isn't
we're
to
all
be Levites.
Kohanim.
We're all Levites in potential.
We're Mamlechas Kohanim, a kingdom of priests, the Goy Kadosh, a holy nation. That's how we were described when we got the covenant back in Yisro, I think it was, around Exodus 19, something like that. So, to be a holy nation means you're not a priest who just serves in the sanctuary. You're a priest who serves in every aspect of nationhood: army, research, agriculture, business. So our kingdom of priests has to be in the army. But among the kingdom of priests are a special class of priest. And then there's the Kohen Gadol, who's a priest. And those people are not supposed to go into the service normally. Nor do they get much land. They have little plots. Lahavdil is squared like a monastery. They have a little plot for growing things and pasturing outside the monastery. So the Levite cities were required to have pasture land and agricultural land outside of them, but they weren't supposed to be really into those things. A bit, I'd say, not just to provide for themselves, but that they should have the basic life experiences besides teaching the Torah. But what's the real problem of this census section that I just read? What is the really difficult problem to understand?
A ransom for yourself.
Right! This whole thing about making atonement, giving something to God. So, who is the simplest commentator on the Bible who usually answers our questions?
Rashi.
Rashi. So let's see what Rashi says about it.
Can we take a guess first? I haven't actually read it yet. But is it because the soul comes from God that we have to acknowledge it?
No. I'm not going to Rashi anyway. Rashi says like this. He says the word tisa doesn't mean lift up, it means to take a sum of something. And he quotes a verse. Does I remember? 1 second. No, here. L'kabel schum minyanam, to take the sum total of them. L'dad kamehe. When you want to do this, kishet tachpots, al timonem l'gilgolet. Don't count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so forth. Ella, yidnu kol echad machzis hashekel. Each one should give half a shekel. But timet hashkolim, you'll count the money rather than counting them. Why? That seems like a roundabout way of doing things. Actually, maybe it is an easier way. If each one tosses a half a shekel into a pot, it's much easier than counting people walking around with a tablet.
Has nothing to do with it.
Like your shekel might have been quite some
Has nothing to do with
Wait a minute.
Not like the shekel's dead.
So, of course, that would involve atonement here. It would be a more convenient way of counting people. 1 second.
Because there was
V'teda, I
quite a
don't
golden
know.
pin, wasn't there?
V'teda, minyanim, and then you will know their number. so that there be no plague among them. What's Rashi say? Sha'aminyan. When you count people, maybe things do. Shaleit bo ayin hara. The evil eye rules over census. V'hadever ba'alehem. And a plague can come on them, apparently as a consequence of an evil eye.
Yeah, religious people don't say how many children they've got. They say chatzim minyan.
Yeah. Now, I wouldn't say religious people. It's East European traditional people. Now. Yeah.
No?
Now, how does Rashi get this sort of thing? This is a very unusual interpretation. That when the Torah says there should be an atonement, no plague should come upon them, because an evil eye comes on that which is counted by plague, right? And that which is counted brings an evil eye, which brings a plague. Where do you know such a thing? Rashi says it's an open passage in the Bible. K'moshe matzinu, as we have found, we made David in the days of David. What's he referring to?
And it had a sense.
He also had.
Is there something wrong in this citation?
That also David had.
Apparently what Rashi's saying is someone was counted in the days of David and a plague came. Alright? Now, that's the end of the Rashi. Is there something missing from that Rashi before we try to understand it?
Well, David was told to count.
Yeah, wait, we'll get to that. We'll get to that in a moment.
Well, it doesn't
But
explain the ransom.
If you were writing the Rashi, alright, how the money to God buys it off or
But
something.
again, if God ordered to count, how can you be afraid?
All right, we'll get there. We don't know about that yet. You know about it because you've been coming for years. But you'll ask most yeshiva boys, they won't know that. I'm serious. Even rabbis often will not know it for a certain reason.
First year I've been coming.
Yeah. No, you came in the Israel Center years ago, right? When your father-in-law came over once, I remember he said, I never believed all this God and religion stuff. I'm an old man, but you made me think maybe it's
He
right.
had his bar mitzvah at 70 years old. With my daughter, when my daughter had her bar mitzvah, he had his bar mitzvah.
How is he?
He's in Australia.
Ah, is he coming?
Yeah, he just went to visit the grave.
Bring him sometime. Now look at the last words of
So
Rashi.
Rashi doesn't explain this.
Yeah, what's that? All right, Rashi doesn't explain. But is there something wrong with this, Rashi? V'hadever ba'alehem, and plague comes upon them. Kamo shemotzinu b'mei David, as we found in the days of David. Is there something wrong with that last phrase? Is that how you would write it if you were Rashi?
Yeah, the time of King David.
Right, is that a good way to express it? How does Rashi usually do this kind of thing? I think. How would you write it?
He preferred to say Shmuel.
Sure. He wouldn't just leave it vague like that. How does that help me as we found the days of David?
Right.
If I don't know it very well, Rashi's to give me basic interpretation. So I need a source. I have to know, simply, how do I find it in the days of David? Rashi would say, Shmuel, so-and-so, Chronicles, so-and-so, whatever. Rashi here gives no source. I have a hunch Rashi's playing a rather cute little game here, maybe. Maybe Rashi didn't want people to look it up, because it might be problematic. Or, maybe Rashi wants them specially to look for it. If you don't know where it is, how will you find it? Where Rashi says, it really happened in the days of David, the plague came on the census. How will you look it up if you're in Rashi's time? Today we have indexes and all, we have things.
Take Sefer Shmuel and start reading.
So the consequence of what Rashi did is you're going to skim through Sefer Shmuel or Divrei Yomim, wherever it talks about the days of David, or the beginning of Malachi, or Tehillim, right? You're going to start skimming Bible. So the net consequence of Rashi's lack, the peculiar way in which he wrote this Rashi, is everybody is going to start looking through the Bible. Not just the Chumash, but Nach. Okay? Now, is there a reason that especially this week, Rashi would want people to study Bible? In Parashat KI-TISA. So what's that to do with Nach? Nobody knows.
Yeah,
we'll come
about
to
the Egel. Do you want to know about the Egel?
But just bear this in mind. The way Rashi's written this is almost as though he wants people to be skimming the Bible. This first Rashi.
Jesus is supposed to be studying the Bible 24 hours a day.
Yeah. But is that the yeshiva tradition? The places which spend the most time on these realms virtually ignore the Bible other than the Chush and the Haftarahs. Very interesting. The modern yeshivas, in this respect, are way above the East European style, black, whatever you want to call them, Haredi yeshivas. In the modern yeshivas, Yeshiva Hesder, Rav Kook, they study Bible, they study Nach. All right. Rashi, I would say here, wants people to do it. But now, where is it? Does anyone happen to know? Where do we read about this plague? You have that Tanakh here.
It's in bits and pieces.
But you have a Shmuel or a Yerei Yomim.
Yeah, I've done everything.
Let me borrow it.
It's 24:10.
In yours it's put
Yes,
in?
it mentions the Rashi and then it gives the
May I see the second?
Samuel.
This is very interesting.
Yeah, Rashi doesn't give the source.
Yeah, no, in this one they put it in. That's very interesting. In the Rashi I have here, in the traditional Mikra Kedolot, it does not have it. There's no source given. In Silberman's, which is wonderful, a scholarly edition of Rashi, they tossed it in at the end, Shmuel Bet Chavdal. I didn't see it in the old one.
Yeah, but Silverman might have added it.
Yes, that's why I assumed.
No, not Rashi.
Yeah, I assumed that, or a later manuscript copy, sure. So, what do you know about 2 Samuel 24? What's unusual about that chapter? Anyone know what's unusual about it? And look, here we are going into the Bible. What's unusual about it is that it's the last chapter of the book of Samuel. So this is an easy way to remember this. It's at the end.
Is that when Samuel slew Agag?
No. Now,
If it's the last chapter, then you would have skimmed through the whole of Samuel.
yes, so you found it. That's also a good point. All right, Chav Dalet. I'll just read it in free translation. And the anger of the Lord again burned against Israel. And he sicked David against them, saying, go and count Israel and Yehuda. Right. Any problems with that verse? Sure.
God is telling him to count.
God told him to count them. He's mad at Israel. And God tells David to count them. Not
If
David.
he hadn't done that, it would have been a sin, wouldn't it?
I don't
God
know.
told him to do it and he didn't do it.
Oh, that is going to raise real problems. And what else do we see from here? An interesting historical, political notion.
Yehuda v'Yisrael.
Yes. Even in the times of David, the two kingdoms were known as such as independent areas, like Yehuda and Shomron today. The north was known as Yisrael, and the south as Yehuda, even though they were united.
But David
later-
did unite the two kingdoms
It was united under Saul and under David.
under David.
Yeah, but they still had separate names at that time. And the king said to Yoav, his general, go around all over the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beersheba and count the people, and I will know what their number is. And Yoav told the king, may God multiply them 100 times, and may the eyes of my king see it. But what do you want this thing for, my master? So Yoav sensed there was something bad in taking the census. Yoav got David out of a lot of jams. Yoav was David's main general, his main confidant, I would say, in political military matters. What was the end of Yoav? Does anyone
Oh,
remember?
he died.
Yes, that's, well, I'm sure by this time.
He was killed by
Who killed him? Which battle did he die in? It's in the beginning of the book of Kings. What does the book of Kings begin with? After finishing David's life in Shmuel, the days of David, what does the book of Kings begin with? Not quite, almost.
So David's called.
David's cold, and the young virgin is brought to warm him up, and David dies. And what does he do as he lays dying? What are his beautiful last words to his son Solomon? Bump off X Up off Y. Chisol cheshbolot, Leibovitz says. Settling scores. These are people who can wreck the whole country, in his opinion. They tell Solomon, if you want your kingdom to be strong, find ways, just let these guys slip up a little, they're still on probation, kill them. One of those was Yoav.
So he was killed by Saul.
Yes. Yeah. At David's orders. So Yoav tries to talk him out of it. But the king insisted. So they did it. And they went all over, it tells where they went. And they finally came back after 9 months and 20 days to Jerusalem. And they gave the number of the people. There were 800,000 soldiers. This was also a military census, not counting women and children. There were 800,000 soldiers in Israel, the land of the 10 tribes. And 500,000, if I remember, just 1 second. 500,000 in Judea. So how big was David's army, or potential army? 1,300,000. That's a big army. Even today, Israel, that would be a huge army. Then David's heart smote him. Right after that, right after he counted the people. There he uses safar, more modern term. And David said to God, I've sinned very much, what I've done. Please, God, forgive me. And he got up in the morning, and God's word came to him via God. Got it? God's word came to him via God. Hanavi. There was a prophet named God. Right? And there's a God Street in Jerusalem, rather famous, because Pardes Institute and Old Panetzion are in God Street in Baka. And this is what the prophet was told to tell to David. God said, I'm giving you your choice of 3 punishments. I'm not going to just forgive you. Take your pick. He told him. He says, you either can have 7 years of famine, as it happened in Shemot, in your land, or 3 months of being chased by the enemy in your land, a 3-month invasion. Or just 3 days of a very dangerous virus, a dangerous plague. Tell me what you want to do. And then he said Tachanun. When we sin, we say Tachanun. Twice a day we fall down on our hands. And we say this verse that David said. And David said to the prophet God, Sar Limo, I'm in terrible shape. Nipla na biyad Adonai. Let me fall in the hands of God. Ki Rabbi Rachamav, because His mercies are always great. Biyad Adam, but in the hands of an enemy man, I will not fall. He figures if there's a human agency mixed into God's punishment, he will suffer more. Like the Egyptians and all, they all did more than God wanted them to do to the Jews. The Germans and Russians and so on. So he figures like this. If it's the enemy chasing him, they're not going to be any mercy, but they're really going to give it to him. More than God would want. If there's a famine, he's going to have to go around buying food all over the world. And they'll probably really put the screws on him in terms of political pressures and money. And it'll ruin Israel. I'll take the 3 days plague. That's strictly from God. Right? It'll work out better. So God did it from 3 days. And all over the country, from Dan to Beersheba, how many died? Does anybody have to know?
70,000.
70,000 Jews died in this plague. And it was merciful, because otherwise, hundreds of thousands might have died. After all, we're dealing with 1 million, whatever happened here, we're dealing with 1,300,000 soldiers. So there died 70,000 each. I would assume it's just males. Then, as the angel was about to strike Jerusalem, to destroy it. But Jerusalem already is a viable entity at this point. God's mercy, as predicted, comes, and God sort of feels bad about the whole thing. And he tells the destroying angel, it's enough. Stop. And at that moment, he was at the threshing floor of Avarna Haivusi. It was still partly in Jebusite city. And he was at Avarna's threshing floor. What is well known about Avarna's threshing floor?
It's,
George Washington slept here, or what's?
no, it's what David bought to build the temple.
Right.
That's right.
At that place where the angel of death stopped, where God's mercy exhibited itself, at that place was the site of the temple. And David said to God, when he saw all the destruction among the people, as I've sinned, and these sheep who are under me, what have they done? Taken out of me and my father's house. And the prophet God came to David saying that build an altar in that threshing floor. And David went up, and Arvana was a nice guy, this Jebusite leader. He feared the king. He offered to give it to him, take my tools, burn them for the wood. Do it. David said, no. I will not sacrifice to God that which I didn't pay for. He's not going to be a tzaddik if he had a mischajman. To give charity through someone else. He'll give the charity. So David bought it from him. Right? And he paid, if I remember, 50 shekels for it. 50 shekels of silver for some cattle for sacrifice and the threshing floor. And there he built an altar to God and made sacrifices, and God listened to their prayers, and the plague stopped from Israel. 70,000 died, but it could have been much worse. That's the end of the story, the end of the book of Samuel. We just finished the book of the Bible. We cheated a little bit. We started with the last chapter. Now, in light of all I just read, back to Rashi. Rashi says they must give a half a shekel as atonement for their souls when you make the census, lest an evil eye bring a plague upon them, as we see in the days of David. All right, what are the problems with the Rashi now?
Now he doesn't say that. He says
that which is counted.
It perfects the evil eye to count them.
Yes, to count them brings an evil eye.
Right.
And the evil eye brings a plague.
Right.
So, first of all, God told David to do it. We have that terrible problem. But
Translating the word
Yes.
not sure.
Make a rationale of such a
Yes.
paradox.
I'll do it, don't worry. Now, and the next problem is, do we see the evil eye there? Yes. Of course. Did you see the evil eye in this chapter in Samuel, which I just read? Where was the evil eye mentioned in 2 Samuel 24 that I just read? David makes the census, the people get struck, and after he picks his punishment, he knows he's done wrong. Where's the evil eye come in? I don't think it's an evil eye. That punishment.
What is the evil eye?
What is the evil eye is a good question.
That's right.
But there's nothing.
It's a catastrophe. It's an evil eye.
Maybe Rashi is just using evil eye as a metaphor. But it's not. You don't call a punishment an evil eye. An evil eye denotes a bad force from someone looking at something and wishing it bad. Do we see that there? No. There's no mention of evil eye whatsoever in this chapter of Samuel. So where does Rashi get this evil eye business from? You see that somehow, on the contrary, it wasn't just an evil eye. We see that what happened? David sinned. That the counting was a sin. And therefore the people get punished. And that's David's problem. I counted, not the people. It was a sin and the people get punished. Is there a word about it being caused by an evil eye? No. So this shows it's always good to look up what Rashi quotes. Even if Rashi doesn't give you the source. Very interesting.
That's it.
How would you solve this whole problem? We now have a really mysterious realm which we don't know what to do with. What would be your next step in solving the problem? We looked up what Rashi quoted in the days of David. What would be the next step? And looking it up made it even worse. Because now it's completely ununderstandable. God told him to do it.
Now you look at the other Mephoshim, the Rambam says.
Would you do that first, or what would you do maybe before that? You look to see if this episode is talked about elsewhere in the Bible. This strange episode in Shmuel, which is Rashi's text for finding out about all this. The question is it talked about elsewhere in the Bible? Is it? Does anyone know?
What counting?
No, this actual case where David counted them and so many died. So maybe to solve our problem, we should look at another text in the Bible which tells the same story, perhaps from a different perspective. And we have a general rule in the Jerusalem Talmud that the words of Torah are always poor in one place and rich in another. And just like this world, you can't understand science or any realm unless you explore everything in the whole universe which relates to it. Maybe somewhere up in Alaska is a plant which contains the key to a biological puzzle or a missing cure for cancer. Who knows? You must look everywhere. As in the Torah, Ben Bakbak says, turn it over and over. Everything's in it if you keep turning it over. So the world has to be constantly turned over, and man has to be constantly looking to find God's secrets in the universe. So we have to look everywhere else in the Torah where a subject is discussed in order to understand it in any one place. Where else is it discussed?
So you look in Divrei Yamim.
Divrei Yamim. You have to know which chapter it's in. I wouldn't have either. It's in 1 Chronicles chapter 21. In 1 Chronicles chapter 21, we read the same story. And let me read it to you. Does anyone know where is Divrei Yamim in the Tanakh? Chronicles?
After Tehillim.
It's after Tehillim, right? And does anyone have a more specific location?
That's the end of
There it is. It's the last book of the Bible. Okay? So we look in 1 Chronicles 21. And what do we see? Band of angels coming after me, coming forth to carry me on. I looked over Jordan, and what did I see? 1 Chronicles 21. Vayamod Satan al Yisrael. Vayoses es David limnoses Yisrael. And Satan stood up against Israel and incited David to count Israel out of the frying pan into the fire. We had problems when we looked up the actual text of the days of David and Samuel. Now our problems get even worse. Instead of describing it as God doing it, Satan. Now that's good in a way. Satan inspired David to do it. It was a sin to count them. We're still left with the problem of why it says God in the other place. But in a certain way, this does solve some of our problems here. If it's God, what's his sin? And David said to Job, the same story, go count the people, the same 3 punishments. And the story is basically the same. There's some details more filled out. What is different is this time the numbers counted are not 800 and 500,000. There's a significant difference in the numbers. And this one at the end, after they're counted, and it says they were elef alafim. There were 1,000,000 Jews, as opposed to 800,000 in the previous story. Northern Jews, Israelites. I'm sorry, 1,100,000 Jews in the north, who were sholev chelev, who were wielded a sword. It's a different expression here. And 470,000 in Judea, which previously had been 500,000. Okay, so perhaps it's counted in a different way. Maybe it includes the armor bearers here. Perhaps that's sholev chelev. The question is why there's less in Judea here. It's talking about the exact same story. And the commentaries have various suggestions how to deal with the numerical discrepancy. Then it says, Vayera b'nei Elohim. The Lord was upset on this thing, and he smote Israel. So it's not just an automatic evil eye here either. It's that there's something wrong. Satan incites David to do something wrong, and God gets mad and the people suffer. Again, no mention whatsoever of evil eye. Now, just to solve our problem, how I can say Satan in one place and God in the other, I would say from what we asked before, it has to be Satan. Because if God told him to do it, how can he be punished? But if it's Satan, why does it say God in the other place? I would say it's against the Zoroastrian religion of Persia. This week we're busy with Persia and we go with Esther. The Zoroastrian religion was in some ways similar to the Jewish. They had no images. They believed in ethics. But I guess they had two gods instead of one. Not even a trinity. They looked at life, seeing that sometimes one prevailed and sometimes the other. They didn't look at it as Hashem Echad. So there's a good force at work in the world, there's a bad force fighting it. Two forces, the forces of light and the forces of darkness. That was the Zoroastrian belief. And some say that was the majority religion in Antiochus' time. Achashverosh's time. And that Haman wanted to introduce idolatry. That he put a symbol of an idol which people bowed down to. And the Jews' defiance and making an issue out of it prevented the Zoroastrians from adopting Haman's views. So in order to get the majority of the empire to accept it, he had indeed to get rid of the Jews. Then the Zoroastrians, if you have two already, so you have a few more. The same way it's often the Orthodox Jews who teach the vegetarians in their health food stores that cheeses contain animal rennet from the making the stomach lines. I remember doing that in Boston. They keep it, but they're not so strict about it. Jews do everything with a vengeance, especially in Jerusalem. Okay, so I would suggest one solution to our problem here is that it's Satan who tells David to do it. But lest you think, like a Zoroastrian, that Satan's an independent force, so it says, and God incited in Samuel. Then ultimately everything leads to God, and the evil in the world is also works in accordance with God's plan. And Satan is also a tool of God. And everything leads to God's path, and you can't avoid it. The only thing is, you got a straight path, you've got a detour. It's like the two goats on Yom Kippur. The goat which goes to God, and the goat to Azazel, to the devil, the Ramban says. It means that a person must sacrifice. Life is sacrificial. It's not a ball. But he chooses to whom he will sacrifice, God or to meaninglessness. He can make his sacrifice to God. Two goats look exactly the same. It's just a question of intent. Or he can dedicate it to the devil, meaning he'll live a life of abandon with no morals, no standards. But it will wind up being a sacrifice because he'll feel empty and broken when he gets older. At that point in the desert, where he has no depth of accomplishment, the very bankruptcy, the spiritual bankruptcy, will bring him back to God. So the goat to the devil is also presented before God first. Because ultimately the devil leads you back to God too. But as Rev Kook said, there's a straight path, there's a circuitous path, a detour. You can't escape your destiny, but you can sure make it much harder and longer to reach it. Right? Another explanation I would say is this. How does a really great man like David sin? How is his sinning different from that of you or I? Especially I. How is it different?
It's forgetting.
Forgets? Can you forget?
Yeah, in the Hillim he says, I forget that you God and I suffer.
All right, you might forget to look at your candy bar wrapper that you ate meat a couple hours ago. But like when he takes Patsheva, he's forgetting something.
He sins a
His
big
goal
sin.
was to sin.
Yeah, when he does a big sin, maybe. I don't know, maybe. Huh?
His goal must have been to sin.
How? We have free will. How is the process of sinning different? David took a woman, Bathsheba. Other people have taken women too. David counted the people. There was some kind of wrong. Other people have done similar wrongs. How is it different when a great man does it? When the chief rabbi sins? That happens. How is the chief rabbi's sin different than when the average person sins?
Everybody knows. Everybody's
He's
watching.
expected to be so much better than
Yes, so I'm sorry, what did you say?
Everybody's watching.
Yes, but how is the process of sin different?
He's judged more strictly.
I'm sure that's the process of judgment. But how's the process of sin different?
He's the one person that should know.
Yes, but how's the process?
Oh, he's
Because
becoming
he
more
should be an
rational
example,
about
he should
it.
be a
What do you mean by
paradise.
More
rational?
rational about it.
What do you mean? He coolly sins?
No, like the thing with Bathsheba, that he knew the ins and outs of halakha, I suppose.
Right.
Or you would
Ruth
say-
was just kind enough to do an extra long typing job for me this week, and she vaguely recalls from last year's Parsha sheet that when a great man sins, he doesn't think he's sinning. The great man rationalizes. The great man works out an elaborate rationalization to show not only is he not sinning,
But
but he's
even
doing a
lesser men
mitzvah.
do that.
I don't need
Lesser
intention.
Yes,
men do
but
that.
lesser men don't always do it. When a great man sins, he turns it into a mitzvah. When they make a Shabbos demonstration, scream Shabbos and throw stones, they're doing God's will. But if they have any common sense, they'll see it's the devil. In one passage it says God told them to do it, in the other it's the devil. It's the devil that makes them do that because it drives people away from the Torah. But they make it into a mitzvah because they feel like doing it. So here too, when David does it wrong by counting the people, he somehow figured God wants to have this great thing. Look, Israel has 1,300,000 soldiers and nothing's happened. God wants this. It's great, but it's really the devil. When he sins with Bathsheba, the Talmud says anyone who says that David sinned is in error. It doesn't scream at him he's going to be burned in hell or we'll put him in chayrim. They make a mistake. A person could
Do
concede
make a
David.
mistake.
The person who says David sinned. Now, that's a little
So David
difficult.
didn't sin.
Because in the Bible, he didn't sin, but in the Bible you see clearly he did. What's God killing his firstborn?
No, I've heard that it's a misinterpretation of the Bible.
What misinterpretation? The prophet kills his firstborn child from his relationship with Bathsheba. And he sits in mourning and prayer, hoping to save the child dies. So what can be more obvious sin than that? So I would say it's very simple. David hires the devil, the best rabbinical lawyer around.
He's the devil's advocate.
Yes, the devil's advocate, right. A rabbinical lawyer, a Torah rabbi, who will do anything for money and charge as much as he can to benefit from people's misery. So the rabbinical lawyer works out for David a very clever, proper halachic scheme by which he can take Uriah's wife. Uriah deserves death anyway as a rebel, and he'll give a retroactive divorce. So even though he's not dead yet, you can take her now, or take her in your house, or do something. It'll be all right. And it is all right. David violates no law. Well, as the Ramban says, you can be Navah B'Shipah Torah. A person can keep the Torah perfectly and still be pretty disgusting. So David violates a basic moral law, given the whole situation, which was perhaps not definable in legal categories. Anyone who says David sinned, they actually did a wrong thing violating. No, David worked out a whole rationalization. She's my soulmate, the Mashiach will come for her. As the Ger Rebbe said, that they must see the voices in heaven. It's not enough to hear, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not commit adultery. Lo tirtzach, lo signal, lo sinav. Unless you will interpret as though it were spelled lamed vav. For him you may murder, kill, throw the stone on Shabbos. For him you may steal, cheat the non-religious. For him you may commit adultery. All right, she's married, but she's my soulmate in certain bohemian religious circles. So, all right. So there are such. The ex-hippie who finds the wild soul of a Reb Nachman who doesn't like to be bound down by family and everything. So you have such circles around Jerusalem and other places. Yeah. It's something which Modi'in love. People inform you about these things every once in a while. Now, so anyway, so what happens here? David thinks he's doing a mitzvah. God told him. All right? God's angry at Israel, whatever rationalization, but it's really the same. So there's ways we can deal with the obviously blatant contradiction between Samuel and Chronicles. The problem, though, is still, what's this all about? And what should be our next step of research in trying to check out Rashi's theory that you see that counting brings an evil eye, which brings plague and kills people. And therefore you need to count the shekels not done correctly. And they give an atonement for their soul. There's actually two components. There's two components here. You could say an atonement for their soul simply is another expression maybe that they won't be killed.
So
Not that they've sinned. It's an atonement for their soul. If you count the shekels, still it has to be more than that because they could each give a bead. or some other object which is easily counted. Shekels are heavy. It's a nuisance to schlep
It's a
them
way
around.
of giving charity.
Yes, so some others involve giving to God and charity.
And this is for the running of the temple, isn't it?
Yes, that's what it's used for. Well, it's a funny way to count them. All right. Now, if we're exploring this whole concept of evil eye, what's the next thing we should check out in our research? We would look in the Bible to find what?
What's the
The
evil
good
eyes?
Yeah.
What's the evil
The
eye?
eye and
All right. Do we actually have in the Bible itself the expressions evil eye and good eye?
With the fish, does it have something to do with the fish?
Fish are associated there beyond the evil eye. Yosef is maybe like a fish, and there's no evil eye which rules over him. All sorts of pretty ideas like that. But do we have the eye mentioned in the Bible? You say no. We do in a slightly different form, which may or may not make a difference. Instead of saying ayin hara, it describes ish ra ayin, a man of evil eye. Instead of saying, it's just a slight different way of expressing it. And where does it occur? The book of Proverbs, around 22, 23, 26, somewhere in there. I don't remember exactly. We'll be on the Parsha sheet. It says, do not eat the bread of a man of evil eye. Because he tells you, please come into my house and eat. But he really doesn't want you to have it and you'll choke on it or vomit. Okay? So we get there the notion that it's not good to eat from bread of a person who is what? Forgives it, he's begrudging it, he's stingy. Does evil eye there, a man of evil eye, to know the mystical powers?
Yeah.
No.
It's also suggesting that he might be planning to take advantage of him.
No, it's a moral description. It's not a mystical one. Then we have a man of good eye shares his bread with all. Another verse in Proverbs around the same place. Generous. In Pirkei Avot, we speak about the pupils of Abraham, right? Ayin Tova, if I remember. They have a good eye. They're generous. And a Bilam, Ayin Ra Ayin again. Ayin Ra. They're a bad disposition. So in Pirkei Avot, there's several references to it. In the early Mishnah and Bible, we do not find those terms used in any mystical connotation whatsoever. There are later Talmudic passages, which, like Rashi, suggest the evil eye Flegel, a mystical entity of the evil eye. However, these are later Talmudic passages, and I would tend to guess that they do not represent a truly Jewish view from the Torah. Because if they did, we would probably find some trace of it in the Mishnah or in the Bible itself. So it could be these are secular notions of Babylonian society, which the Jews picked up, like the names of the months, which even have idolatrous origins. And this was the Weltanschauung, the scientific worldview of the age. And the rabbis assumed it as part of their truth of reality, because God never did teach them about science. As the Rambam's son says in his introduction to the Haggadah, that just as you're required to have faith that the rabbis have transmitted the Torah correctly from Sinai, you're required not to have any faith in their secular statements because they don't know anything about fixing washing machines. The Torah doesn't teach that. This is the view of many. Hirsch, Soloveitchik, the Rambam's son, and so forth. It's found in the introduction of the Rambam's son, which is printed in the front of every Ein Yaakov. Okay? So I would say in closing that I would tend to reject this Rashi. The Abarbanel, in the sense of molding my life after it, the Abarbanel does accept the notion of evil eye affecting things that count, they're counted. But he says it doesn't apply when you're doing a mitzvah. He says ridiculous. Well, he says when Saul counted the people, you do have that, where Saul counted 4, you don't see any effects, they're bad. When the Levium were counted, there were no half shekels. Also, if you say that the half shekel somehow prevented this, what, David didn't know the trick? And if Yoav was afraid of the danger, he couldn't count with half shekels, the king would have objected. Very difficult. David wouldn't accept what Moshe was taught. So the Abarbanel sort of rejects this whole thing. He says, when you're counting for a good purpose in the mitzvah, nothing happens. So according to the Abarbanel, even though he believed in evil eyes and all, if I'm looking for a minion, I can count people, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, something like that. And not have to use that pasuk, which they substitute with the 10 words, Hoshea Samecha, Ovarechas Nachlasecha, even giving a blessing as you're counting them. Orei v'naseim ad olam, you should lift them up, Kisisa, ad olam, to eternity. They're beyond counting. Very nice. Yeah, but according to Barbanel, you don't need it when you're doing a mitzvah. Now, what do Meforshim such as he and the Radak and so forth say was the trouble with David's counting at 70,000 died? That the counting itself was a sin. Why? Because there was no need to do so. David had won the wars already. I believe he was fighting Philistines. I don't remember exactly who. He won those wars. It was time to send everybody home. But David did what, thank God, Megan almost did but didn't do, I thought was very wrong, to celebrate a main anniversary of Israel with a big military parade. Now, David took great glory in his troops, 1,300,000, nobody died, maybe or almost nobody died. And look at the armies of Israel. Now, David's intention in this was probably, again, a mitzvah. God saved us, God made us prosper, God gave us a lightning 6-day war victory. Praise the Lord! Bypassing the ammunition. No ammunition area, but a military parade. However, what is the effect on the people? The effect on the people is that they don't, God, all this stuff is very abstract. They see a big military parade. And that the ideal of the Jew is the strong Israeli soldier. That is not the ideal of the Jew. The ideal of the Jew is a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. The strong soldier is to be praised. He's a necessary component. But he's an unfortunate component. He himself feels lousy that he has to do this. The Jewish soldier does not rejoice in war as the Arab soldier. It's a damn nuisance which he has to do, a horrible thing. And that's the difference. So when David so aggrandizes the militaristic, he is causing the people to lose a sense of their mission and purpose, which is not to fight everybody, but to establish a really holy model state which will inspire everybody and reform the whole world. Should be building a Beit HaMikdash instead of aggrandizing his army. And God says, that's the Pitaron to stop this plague. Build a Beit HaMikdash. V'shachanti b'tolcham. I will dwell in the midst of them, not in the Mikdash, in them. It's a place to inculcate God into every Jewish spirit, who will then take him back to Galilee and New York and England and wherever he comes from when he comes up to the temple 3 times a year. All right? So that's the message. It's moral limiting of the people, dragging them down. The seesaw is going down again by this great stress on military counting, on military census, when there's no need for it. I mean, it makes sense as you count people for a war. Nothing wrong with that. Okay, and I'm sure David knew the trick of the half shekel. I mean, according to Rashi, it comes out a very different fellow. But David did know that little trick to get around it. He was a rebel. Very difficult to say that. Okay, so we've dealt with the first verse. Now, the only other question that's unanswered is what's it all doing here about the half shekels? Of course, the idea of the half shekel too is that no man should feel he's complete. Right? Everyone's a half. Keep stressing a half. You're the richest guy, the poorest guy. And a certain realm we're individuals, and in a certain aspect or realms, we are one component in a greater entity than ourselves called Knesset Yisrael, people of Israel. From Abraham to the Messiah, spanning time and place. It's not the normal concept of peoplehood. It's a much greater concept. And Professor Irving Agus, one of my best teachers, once said, picture some fish in a fish pond, and a dog runs through. And the next day's Aquarian newspaper speaks about the 4 mysterious things from outer space, which were seen moving about rapidly in abandoned fashion through our world. Of course, since it's a shallow fish pond, they don't understand that those 4 vertical space vehicles are linked above by a body which is a dog. They view it as 4, not 1. So he says, from our limited perspective in our human fish pond, we see each of us as an individual state. But the collective Nishmat Yisrael, soul of Israel, which is a reality, a transcendental reality, but we're too low to perceive it. We don't see that. So we look at it all as individuals. It's only true up to a level. Each leg is independent, but up to a level. Now, Ibn Ezra tries to deal with the order of the matters in our parsha. So he says something very simple. He says, we finished last week's portion with the Kohen making atonement for the corners of the golden altar once a year. He says, since that's a once-a-year thing, and this half shekel, as we later find out, was a once-a-year institution for the temple, the communal offerings were bought, which had to be separated year by year with this money. So it was put next, the half shekels, as another case of a once-a-year procedure involving the temple. Very nice. And he also says it's an unusual offering and it's compulsory, whereas all the offerings we had up till now were voluntary. Then we go on to our next matter. So we finished our first little matter.
Does he explain why the Jews had to be counted? I don't remember what the reason is.
The Jews had to what?
What was the advantage of counting them? I did have to be
Oh,
counted.
but you have to count. Rashi mentions. Very nice. When Moshe will count them, by the way, what was the first time they did this? What was the silver used for? Does anyone know?
Oh, the golden
No.
calf?
For the hooks, for the walls of the...
Yeah, for hooks and the sockets, mainly for the sockets of the boards of the tabernacle. Let's see if I have a good picture here.
Yeah, the bases. You mean the bases?
Yeah, sockets. You see, here's a picture of the tabernacle, and there's silver sockets underneath the gold-covered acacia wood Lego or Tinker Toy type boards. Right? So those silver sockets, there's brass sockets in the outside courtyard. Here you see them again over here. Those silver sockets and hooks, which held the curtains, and silver fillets, which were on the boards of the courtyard. See if I find that one. 1 second. The court of the tabernacle. See that these boards had silver stripes or fillets in them, and there were hooks and things of that sort, made out of silver. All sorts of hardware. Here you see the sockets. These are not the ones, though. These are the sockets for the poles of the courtyard, not the boards of the tabernacle. These were bronze. But you do have silver here and silver here, as I recall. And you have the silver sockets again of the tabernacle itself. The tabernacle is within the courtyard, just to refresh your memory. Here's a diagram. There's the tabernacle. There is the animal altar, which is not in the tabernacle. It's outside of it. First man must curb and temper his animal passions, his primal drives, before he gets the higher levels of holiness of the tabernacle. He goes from the courtyard to the animal altar to the tabernacle. And he keeps progressing till he's at the Holy of Holies within the tabernacle. Okay? There's the courtyard picture.
The courtyard is a double square. Do you remember? It's 50 by 100.
Yes.
And so is the Choshen.
Yes,
Square.
but the Choshen like combines it, because folded over it becomes a square. We'll deal more with that next week. The squares and rectangles and so forth within the tabernacle. We'll stop shortly. What time is the fast over? About 6:15, 6:20?
It's 10 past 6 now.
Yeah, I know that. What time is the fast over?
Check, I think I've got
Must be half past 6.
Now, so the Ibn Ezra goes on that after this matter of the half shekels, we are then told about making the bronze or brass laver. See if I can find that. And he says, why is that delayed till now? He said, because that was also an unusual contribution. Just like the half shekels were compulsory and everything else was voluntary, this was a special voluntary gift which the women gave of their mirrors, which at that time were polished copper. And they had used those mirrors to seduce their husbands when they got depressed in Egypt, enabling the continuation of Jewish people. We'll get to that next week. So here's the laver, and its cups for washing and so forth. So this laver, which stood between the altar and the tabernacle, was also a special levy, so it's listed in our parsha. Following that are the spices for the anointing oil, with which Aaron and his sons and their clothes and all the utensils in the tabernacle were anointed. That anointing oil spices were also a special donation in the Judean campaign, given by the princes. And similarly, the spices for the incense, which was burnt on the golden altar. Okay? So all these special donations, according to the Ibn Ezra, are listed separately. What's a little difficult in his position, in my opinion, is that the fact that these are special offerings was not mentioned in our parsha. It's only mentioned in the next one, by Yaakov Fogelman. There's another picture of the laver, which is a very good one. Okay? And then we go on from there, after all these instructions.
Why is the cure left till now?
I just explained why, because it's a special donation.
Right.
Now, that's a good guess, but at least he deals with the problem. I didn't see others do it. After that, the Tzalel is appointed in charge of all the work. And what's his name? Betzalel
Ben Uri,
Ben Uri.
Ben Chor.
Betzalel ben Uri ben Chor. And who was with him?
What?
No, who was with Betzalel?
Ahadi,
Eliav ben
Achi.
Samach, something like that. What's the difference between their names? Betzalel ben Uri ben Chor.
Is that the same Chor that went to...
Wait a second. Well, what's the difference between their names? The two guys, great spiritual artists who were in charge of the tabernacle. One is called Betzalel ben Uri ben Chor, and the other is called what is it again? Huh?
Eliab.
No, Eliav ben Achisamach. All right. What's the difference in their names?
One's given his grandfather.
One goes back one generation, and one goes back two. So there's a special attention on Granddad. Granddad Chur brings us to our next subject. Right after the Jews are told that Shabbat, you don't work on the Mishkan and the Tabernacle. Holiness of time may transcend out of space, but you do make offerings on Shabbat, like the menorah. So Shabbat's prohibitions are learned from what we do with the Tabernacle. Everything you make for the Tabernacle is what is prohibited on Shabbat, comprising of 39 major categories. Then we come to the golden calf. Who was in charge while Moshe was up there on the mountain? That's not a complete answer.
Aaron and Paul.
Aaron and Hur went up a little bit with him. And then Moshe said, if you got any problems while I'm gone, see Aaron and Hur. Who held up Moshe's hands in the Battle of Amalek? Aaron and Hur. So Hur, his nephew, according to the Talmud, son of Kalev and Miriam. Hur was next in line for Moshe's job, probably. Aaron went on to his own job as priest. Hur was a really big man. Where is he next mentioned in the Tanakh? In the Chumash? Anybody? Where is he next mentioned in the Chumash? No place. Suddenly he disappears. So the rabbis fill in only through the oral tradition can you understand the Chumash. Here is a clear problem. It says, when they came for the golden calf, Hur said, no way. And they said, goodbye, and they killed him. And that explains why Aaron gave in. Aaron helps them and tries to stall them. Why did he fight back? Moshe says, what have you made this people do? But there's one intervening fact, which isn't here. They murdered Torah. And that's why he's giving credit as a martyr in the name of God. That not only is Betzalel's father mentioned, but his grandfather. The Mishkan, the tabernacle, which rectifies the people's request in the right way, maybe what Aaron was trying to do. That you will have something which appeals to the senses and is perceivable. Not just an abstract God, but a table and an ark and a menorah and altars and shofar. You'll have all that, but there's such a configuration that will gradually draw you away from the sense-perceivable material into God himself. So his grandson is the one who builds God's tabernacle. So the golden calf, they get nervous that Moshe doesn't come back on time according to their calculations. 6th hour comes, he's not around. And then they make the golden calf. They have Aaron make it. Aaron throws, as he later describes it, he throws their gold in the fire. He says, bring your daughters and your wives' jewelry. He tries to stall them. He says, I'll make it myself. I'll do it right. That takes more time, like Noah building the ark, so they can repent. Aaron knows that daughters aren't going to give up their jewelry and their wives. And the women won't, because the women are better than the men. They said, we won't have anything to do with idolatry. And they like their jewelry. And that's why the women merit, they don't join the spies. So Shasani Kirtzono, she says every morning, you may be God just like yourself. Thank God I'm not so bad as a man. I'm a more spiritual being, a more family-oriented being, a more civilized being. And the man says, Shalom Asani Isha. I cannot provide the Isha, the higher spiritual force that I need. I cannot provide for myself. I have to get a real Isha. I'm not an Isha. And I need all these mitzvahs and Torah and yeshivas and shuls. I need all this stuff. Okay? That's the difference. So, the guys, then they bring their own jewelry. They have such a passion for this idolatry. And Aaron throws it in and the calf emerges. And they say, these are your gods. These are your gods who took you out of the land of Egypt. Aaron wanted to be a symbol of God. Now what's this? These are your gods, O Israel. Who's speaking? And they said, these are your gods, O Israel. So Hirsch and others learned it. It's not the Jews. It's the Erev Rav, the Nach Schleppers, the heathen who joined them at their moment of glory, as happens in the Purim story. Okay? The heathen, They're the ones who really worshipped it as an idol. The Jews wanted it to be some kind of concrete symbol, like the lions on the ark, or the cherubim in the temple ark. That's all. But they got the Jews to start worshiping it. They said, these are your gods, Israel. And then the Jews started to worship too. And then Moshe's up there with God. He's at the highest points. God said, stop. Your people have got themselves all corrupt. Go down quick. They've sinned. And Moshe leaves God and goes down. And when he actually sees it, they're not going to be changed so quick, like our President Herod problem. It's more serious. He doesn't go down and straighten it out. Then he smashes the tablets. And they're having a wild disco there, all sorts of terrible things. Moshe says, whoever's to God, come to me. And by the way, how many golden calves were in the Bible? 3. Jeroboam, when he makes his rebel kingdom, he doesn't want the people to go to Jerusalem. He sets up 2 golden calves in Dan and Beth-El later. So there's something innate in the calf. They use the same expression. Hey, that's what you smile. These are your gods, Israel.
Why the calf?
That's what I'm asking. I don't know the answer, but it's interesting. Some say because it had this tradition, but the tradition is bad. It's very strange. It's the exact same thing. There's something in it.
It's interesting. The Indians.
I suggest that people on Purim maybe dress up as golden calves, and maybe they'll get the feeling.
On Sonia Cheskel, the animals that pull the chariot have regel shore.
Ah, sure. It's interesting. That's the highest of domestic
They
animals.
saw the regel, so they said if it's a regel, it must be a shore.
Very interesting. On the divine chariot, they see the ox's leg. And
Do you know that cows can't bite?
Really?
They've only got teeth on one jaw. They've got teeth.
It's a symbol of benevolent
You
God.
can
Anyway,
try in a cow's mouth, they can't bite.
so 3,000 Jews are killed, and then a plague comes, and Moshe goes back to pray for them, and God says, okay, I'll let it go for now. I'm not going to forget it. They're on probation, and whenever they do something wrong, the calf is going to come up again. They'll get a real punishment. But they're on probation. And God promises the secular Zionist dream. I will take them to the land. I will defeat their enemies. They'll be rich. Everything is fine. The secular Zionists will be overjoyed. One thing, I can't go with them anymore. They're not on the level to have God's presence in their midst. Mishkan experience. They can't do it. I'll send to the angels. He'll take care of everything. Like the father who mails a check to his hippie son, doesn't want anything to do with him. They'll take care of him. But the Jewish people was not secular Zionists. They were religious Zionists. And they sit down to weep and they take off all their jewelry. And Moshe says, we're not going to budge from here unless your presence goes with us. And if you want to destroy the people, God offers them a deal which others might accept. Moshe says, no deal. Wipe me out of your book, out of the book of life, or out of them, or out of your Torah, as we saw last week. And finally, God promises his presence will go with them, but there's going to be a while where Moshe has to move his tent out of the camp, and God will come to him over there. Okay? So that's what happens in our Sedra. After the huge highs, as Leibovitz says, because it was all external. Miracles, wonders, splitting of the Red Sea, Mount Sinai, it's all external. People hadn't really changed within. And therefore, when it comes to Purim, Kibbutz Aleichem, they were almost under the great miracles, they accepted things. But a true, mature acceptance of free people who can fight for themselves came at Purim's time, where they didn't need God revealed. God's name is not even in the Megillah. Okay? So, that, I think, pretty much finishes, one second, the matter of the golden calf. Just a second. Golden calf black kosher nightclub. Oh, Aaron says, when he makes the calf, a holiday for God tomorrow. What do you mean a holiday for God tomorrow? All right, they say Aaron really intended this to somehow be worked in, like the Mishkan, to God's worship. But others say very simply, what was the next day when Moshe came down? Shiva Asa B'Tammuz. And Aaron sees it's going to be a day of mourning and tragedy. But as Zacharias says, all the days of mourning, again, it's the indirect path to God. All the days of mourning will be turned to days of joy in the end. That they will bring back to God. So Aaron says it will be a chag to God. God somehow will get through this terrible phase. God, unlike the Christian view, does not reject the Jews. But machar, bukra, it'll take some time. Machar doesn't just mean tomorrow physically. It means in the distant future often. All right? Well, let's just see. I think we pretty well got it. And God gives... Oh, the last thing is, after Moshe, after the sin, he gets God's forgiveness. He says, God, now really show me yourself. I want to see how you work in the world. How does it all work? What a chutzpah at this moment, after they've sinned and everything is terrible. No. Because Moshe realizes when he left the Kolel of Kolels, Har Sinai, to go down and deal with the people at the golden calf disco, at that moment, eventually he would get a deeper insight into God. And God says, you're right. Stand here. You won't be able to see me from the front because you can't live, but you'll see my back. What does that mean? Probably that But to see God's ways in the future, we can't know what's going to happen in our lives. None of us. But sometimes we're given the insight. After many years, we understand why something happened to us before. We can see God's back as he marches through history. Okay? And God proclaims his name and his traits. He looks back at the people. It's not simple. He remembers the sins of fathers and their possible effect on the kids, cutting one way or the other for 3 or 4 generations. Hashem, Hashem, it's the same God before the sin, after the sin. God remains constant. It's just a human perspective that changes. Hashem, Hashem, Kel Rachim Chanun, and Achapayim Rachetzav Emes. And when a good act is done, it affects thousands of generations. Don't say Chesed L'Alofim. And he bears sin. He's not such a rush to punish. Man should not be either, as the Targum says. But things don't go overlooked either. And 3 or 4 generations are considered when dealing with descendants of people who got problems. And Moshe quickly bowed down. And anyway, he says to God, please come back in our midst, and God promises him. And now wonderful things, after they've done tshuva, repented, even more wonderful things will happen to the Jewish people, as is beginning to happen in our time, despite all of its problems. Okay? Because they must keep all the commandments and not link up with the idol-worshipping natives of the land of Israel at that time. Because God is jealous and so forth. And through marriage and friendship, you'll eventually wind up in idolatry, which doesn't apply to the Arabs, because they don't worship idols. And then the holiday festivals, the 3 times a year the Jews have to come up, is described here. This is one of several places in the Torah where the holidays are described. And he says, write down these words, because by the mouth of these words, the oral law, and Purim is considered the festival of the oral law. The deeper, that which can the people of Israel operating through the oral law, they themselves have a holiness and chosenness, which is the subject of our parsha, which Amalek cannot accept. Be it the Anglican Bishop of Jerusalem, who, in his wicked ways, in the post the other day, said how terrible the Jews are treating the Arabs. Without mentioning once that the Arabs are trying to destroy us all this time. And they're wrecking the country and blocking the roads and letting people bodies and so that's Amalek. He doesn't want the Jewish people to be chosen. But yes, the Old Testament speaks that way, but things have changed. Crazy. That's Amalek. So what happened?
And if you watch television last night, there was an American rabbi who said that he won't feel comfortable in Israel until all the Arabs feel comfortable.
There's something to that, the way that once we're all good and really a holy kingdom of priests, a holy nation, the Arabs will shape up too. They'll accept our leadership. But meanwhile, you got to have order in the place. All right? So he was there 40 days and 40 nights, and he wrote the words of the covenant, the 10 commandments. All right? Just one second, and there's one more point, I think. You have laws of Pesach here and Chametz. About the Korban Pesach, can't stay overnight, can't be made with Chametz. Now, so the oral covenant, that's a Purim message also in this parsha, is God's unique covenant with the Jewish people. What is the oral covenant? That the people of Israel determine God's will, which can't be seen just from the written book. And how do they do it? They go out of Egypt from darkness to light, not in Purim. They turn darkness into light. The Jewish people, if it's really into the Torah, turn all its chaos resolution, chaos theory. They turn all that is dark into light. And it suddenly turns out that the very darkness itself brought the light, brought their repentance. Mashpil Geim Umay B'Yishvali lowers the high in order that he may raise them again as the lowly becoming high. A Yerida L'Tzarach Aliyah, a descent for ascent, which will be Rabbi Fleer's subject tonight, 8 o'clock at our center. The Kabbalah, Amalek, the snake, and Purim. It should be outstanding. Okay? And then he wrote the 10 Commandments. Up to now they had only heard it. And then this time they saw his face was shining and the Jews had done repentance. And they couldn't take it. They were scared of Moshe. His face shone, which led Michelangelo to translate literally and make the horns. So Moshe would cover his face except when communicating with God or handing over instructions with the people, but his tent was outside. And it says when God finished speaking to Moshe, this is the last point, by him, the kalos, okay? When God finished speaking with Moshe, and so forth. But how would you spell that? 1 second. I have to find it. Does anyone recall where that pasuk is? Ibechalos l'daberim, or something like that. I can't find it at the moment. And it's very late, so I'll just tell you the word. It says when God, meanwhile you look it up, okay?
No, I was going to search the
Somebody, give the gentleman in the corner the Chumash and find it for me.
Are you going to Rabbi
Just 1 second, 1 second, 1 second. It says when Moshe finished his conversation with God, when God finished delivering to Moshe all his words. This is really an end for a fast day. Esther's fast, by the way, has only been observed apparently since the 7th century. It's not quite on the strict list of biblical fast. And if someone's even a little bit sick, they give it there. Now, instead of spelling finished, the chaloso with daberimo, when he finished speaking with him, with 2 vavs, it's spelled with only one. The chaloso, chaf, lamed, saf, with only one vav. So you could, without the vowels, you would then tend to read it bekalato. It would read, and when God with his bride spoke to Moshe, all right? And God, or as his, with his bride spoke to Moshe. What does this mean? So Rashi says, God gave him the Torah as a bride. A bride is the greatest thing in the world. A wife we don't speak about so much. God will rejoice over you as a chassid with a kala, a bridegroom with his bride, not as an older man with his wife. What's so great about the bride? She's new and fresh. You don't know her. Familiarity breeds contempt. You don't know her, and you begin to explore each other in every realm. And gradually the picture unfolds. So Moshe was up there. He was learning all about the Mishkan and how to be interrupted because of the golden calf. So God said, I'm giving you the Torah like a bride. It's all new and fresh. You don't know much about her. And you'll gradually get to know her. Okay? Very nice word. And Rashi gives a second word. The Torah is like a bride because in Isaiah are described the 24 adornments with which the bride is adorned. And Rashi says, what is that a metaphor for? Israel is the bride and God is the groom. And what are the 24 adornments with which the bride?
Books of
the 24 books of the Bible. English ladies know their Bible. And therefore, he says, a Talmud Chacham has to be adorned with the 24 books of the Bible, as we said before, like the students, the Hester Yeshiva and Rev Cook and so forth, who stress Bible study along with Talmud study. But he's not adorned, he's not beautiful without the Bible. Because the Bible, as I mentioned by Davidson and so forth, doesn't just give the legal, technical aspect, but gives the existential perspective, the spiritual insight, things which may not be found directly in the law itself. And when a Talmud Chacham is lacking the Bible, then it's a lopsided development, where there's a certain dry, legalistic mentality, which is missing the poetic side, the overview side. So therefore today, of all days, we study Samuel and Chronicles and Proverbs and so forth. And maybe that is why Rashi, with whom we started out, did not give the source in Samuel as he might usually, because he specifically wanted this week for every Jew to have a little bit of the adornments of the bride and to skim through the book of Samuel. A happy Purim, there's no time to do anything on Purim. At the moment,
do we have to say any prayers before we start eating?
I don't know. I think we know. Because we don't have a minion for my room now, so it just... now I can appreciate it.